1964, someone killed 12-year-old Mary Theresa Simpson and got away with it for 62 years. Police didn't even have a name for her killer. They just wrote John Doe in the file. He kept living in the same small town the whole time. He raised 3 kids. He served in the army. He died in 2004, completely free, completely unknown. Then, 18 years after his death, in a lab in Texas, scientists rebuilt his identity from a piece of DNA smaller than a grain of salt. This is the story of how a police department kept a 62-year promise to her family, and how close that promise came to being broken by an ice storm in Memphis. Quick thing before we start. This one's different from the cases we usually cover here, because this one actually got solved, and it happened only a few months ago, which is part of why it's worth telling slowly and properly instead of rushing through it. If stories like this are the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe now, tap like if you're glad this one finally got an answer, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from tonight. This case has a lot of ground to cover, more than any single case we've done on this channel before, so get comfortable. We're going to take our time with it. Elmira, New York sits in the southern tier, close enough to the Pennsylvania border that in 1964, it still felt like the kind of small city where everyone's paths crossed eventually. It had factories along the river, church socials on Sundays, a downtown you could walk end to end in 20 minutes, and streets full of kids who spent their evenings outside long after dinner, the way kids did before anyone thought to worry about it. It was the kind of place where a family could live for 3 generations without ever needing to explain who they were to a new neighbor. Mary Theresa Simpson was 12 years old, and by every account from people who knew her, she was an ordinary kid living an ordinary early 60s childhood. She had an older sister, Linda, close enough in age that they shared a bedroom in the whole private language of inside jokes the way sisters do. They played kick the can with the other kids on their street until the porch lights came on, and skated up and down the sidewalk on metal wheels that clamped straight onto the soles of their shoes, tightened with a little key you kept on a string around your neck so you'd never lose it. Their mother was pregnant that spring with a 3rd daughter neither girl had met yet, a sister who would grow up only ever knowing Mary as an absence, a name spoken carefully at the dinner table. On the evening of March 15th, 1964, Mary went to visit a cousin who lived on the east side of Elmira. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't far. She'd made the walk before, and there was no reason for anyone in her family to think this particular evening would be any different than the dozens before it. Around 11 o'clock at night, she said her goodbyes and started the walk home. By the standards of a lot of households today, 11 o'clock might sound like a late hour for a 12-year-old to be walking alone. But in a small city in 1964, in a neighborhood where families had known each other for a generation, it wasn't the kind of thing that raised alarm in the moment. She simply never made it home. What happened in the hours after Mary left her cousin's house has never been fully reconstructed. Not in 1964, and not even now, 6 decades and a full confirmation's worth of DNA evidence later. What is known is that 4 days after she went missing, on March 19th, her body was discovered in a wooded area off Combs Hill Road, roughly 5 miles from her home, hidden beneath a pile of rocks, sticks, and dirt. as though someone had taken the time to make sure she wouldn't be easily found. She had been sexually assaulted, and her cause of death was ruled to be strangulation. It's the kind of detail that's genuinely hard to sit with, and we're not going to dwell on it beyond stating it plainly, because the rest of this story isn't about the worst 4 minutes of Mary's life. It's about the 62 years that came after, and the people who refused to let her case simply fade into an unmarked folder in a records room. News of the discovery moved through Elmira the way it does in any small city. Fast, and with the particular kind of dread that settles over a place when a child goes missing and doesn't come home safe. For the families along Mary Street, the ones who'd watched her and Linda skate past their porches 100 summer evenings, this wasn't a story on the radio about somewhere else. It was a 4-day search that ended the worst possible way. 5 miles from the house where her mother was still waiting, still pregnant, still hoping. For those 4 days between Mary's disappearance and the discovery of her body, Elmira did what small cities in 1964 tended to do when a child went missing. Neighbors joined the search. Local men who knew the wooded areas around the city walked them systematically, and police worked with whatever manpower a department that size could spare for a search of that scale. There was no Amber Alert system, no cell phone location data, no social media to spread her description in minutes. There was word of mouth, local radio, and people who simply put down what they were doing and started looking, the way communities that size tend to when something like this happens to one of their own children. It wasn't enough to bring her home safely. By the time she was found, 4 days had already passed. In 1964, American law enforcement had fingerprinting, basic blood typing, and whatever a detective's own instincts could piece together from a crime scene. DNA analysis wouldn't exist as an investigative tool for another 22 years. And even once it did exist, it would take decades more before it could be applied usefully to evidence this old and this degraded. Elmira police worked Mary's case the only way available to them in the mid-1960s. Canvassing the neighborhood, interviewing anyone who'd been near the route between the cousin's house and the Simpson home that night. Chasing down anyone with the history that made investigators uneasy. None of it produced an arrest. Whoever had done this hadn't been seen by a single witness willing to come forward. Hadn't left an obvious physical trail beyond what officers collected at the scene, and had no known connection to Mary or her family that anyone at the time could uncover, no matter how many doors they knocked on. What separated this investigation from 100 others that quietly died in the 1960s is a decision that, on paper, sounds almost mundane. Officers collected physical evidence from the scene, including Mary's clothing and personal effects, and they kept it. Not because they had any concept of what DNA testing would someday be able to do with it, since that technology was still more than 2 decades away from existing at all, but simply because collecting and preserving evidence for an open homicide was standard practice, full stop. That single, unremarkable administrative habit, repeated by officers who mostly didn't live to see how it would eventually matter, is the entire reason this case was solvable 62 years later, instead of forever unknowable. For the remainder of the 1960s, through the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, the case sat open but dormant. One of those files that gets pulled out and reread by a new detective every few years, checked against whatever new database or technique has emerged since the last time anyone looked, and then quietly put back. William Maloney, who would later retire as a sergeant himself, joined the Elmira police force as a patrolman just a year after Mary's death, and worked the same streets for years afterward. He later described walking a beat in those days and meeting what felt like 1 million people over the course of his career. And he never once heard the name that would eventually close the case. Whoever Mary Skiller was, he wasn't someone the department had ever had a reason to look at twice. Mary's sister Linda grew up, grew older, had a life of her own, and never once stopped thinking about her sister every single day. The way she later described it as 78 years old. Their mother, who had been pregnant with a third daughter the spring Mary died, raised that daughter never knowing who had taken her middle child or why, and passed away herself before ever getting the answer her family had waited 2 generations for. In a case like this, the absence of an answer isn't a single wound. It's something a family carries forward and hands down, quietly, to people who never even met the person they're grieving. In a city the size of Elmira, a case like Mary's doesn't stay contained to the family alone. It becomes part of the place itself. The kind of story that gets mentioned when longtime residents talk about the city's history, revisited every so often in local papers around a significant anniversary, passed down to people who weren't even born when it happened, but who grew up knowing there was a name and a date attached to something terrible that had never been resolved. Departments carry cases like this differently too. Every new detective who came through Elmira PD across 6 decades would at some point have had this file handed to them, read through it, checked whatever new technology had emerged since the last read, and understood, implicitly, that solving it would mean something not just for the department's record, but for a family that was still out there, still waiting, still asking. DNA testing finally became a viable forensic tool in the mid-1980s. But having the technology exist and having it apply usefully to a 20-year-old piece of evidence are 2 very different things. It wasn't until 2003, nearly 40 years after Mary's murder, that Elmira investigators, by then led in this case by Sergeant William Goodwin, resubmitted her preserved clothing, her purse, and hair samples collected from the scene to the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center for testing. A cutting from her underwear and her skirt tested positive for the presence of semen. A genetic profile was successfully developed from it and entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database that stores genetic profiles primarily from convicted offenders, and in some states, from certain arrestees, allowing investigators anywhere in the country to check unsolved evidence against people already known to the system. There was no match. Whoever had left that DNA behind in 1964 had never been arrested for anything serious enough in any state to land their genetic profile in CODIS. In November of 2014, investigators tried again, resubmitting the same evidence to the same lab, hoping that another decade of new entries into the system might have finally caught the right person. Again, nothing. 2 attempts, 11 years apart, both ending exactly where the original 1964 investigation had ended, with a genetic fingerprint of a killer who existed somewhere in the world, and absolutely no way to connect it to a name, because CODIS can only ever return a match to someone whose profile is already sitting inside it. It would be easy to imagine at this point that the case simply sat there, one more cold file among thousands across the country, technically open but practically abandoned. That isn't what happened. Sergeant Goodwin kept the case active in a way that mattered, even when there was nothing new to test. He made sure the physical evidence itself never degraded further, kept in careful, deliberate storage, at times literally in a freezer at the Elmira Police Department, exactly as it had been since 1964. Resubmitted every decade or so, the moment a new technique seemed promising enough to justify using up more of an irreplaceable sample. He was, in effect, betting on a future technology that didn't exist yet, on the strength of nothing more than the belief that someday it might. What Goodwin and the department couldn't have known in 2014 was that the very thing standing between them and an answer wasn't a lack of effort, or a lack of preserved evidence, or even a lack of DNA. It was that CODIS, the tool they'd used both times, was built to answer one very specific question. Has this person's DNA already been collected because they were convicted of a crime? Alfred Murray never had been. The technology that would eventually identify him wouldn't come from a criminal database at all. It would come from something closer to a family reunion. The technology Sergeant Goodwin was quietly betting on arrived in the form of forensic investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that had already made international headlines for cracking cases once considered permanently unsolvable. Most famously, the Golden State Killer investigation in California, which identified a serial predator responsible for dozens of crimes across the 1970s and 80s using exactly this method. Rather than searching only for an exact match in a criminal database like CODIS, genetic genealogy builds outward from whatever DNA is available, uploading a genetic profile into consumer genealogy databases whose users have opted in to allow law enforcement matching, and comparing shared DNA segments measured in units called centimorgans to estimate how closely related two people are. A parent and child share an enormous number of centimorgans. A third or fourth cousin shares only a small, scattered handful. From there, genealogists work the way any family historian would, cross-referencing surnames, marriage records, obituaries, and census documents, slowly building an enormous, branching family tree outward from a handful of distant genetic matches, until the branches eventually converge on one specific person who fits both the DNA and the circumstances of the crime. In 2022, the Elmira Police Department received grant funding specifically for DNA evidence assessment in Mary's case, and turned to Othram Incorporated, a laboratory that specializes in exactly this kind of complex, severely degraded forensic DNA analysis, using a technique called forensic-grade genome sequencing, which is capable of reconstructing a usable genetic profile from evidence far more damaged and far smaller than the standard STR profiling used for routine CODIS submissions. The sample Elmira investigators had to work with wasn't large to begin with in 2003 or 2014, and after 2 decades of prior testing had consumed even more of it. By 2022, they were working with approximately 0.4 nanograms of usable genetic material. It's worth sitting with what that number actually means. A single grain of table salt weighs roughly 60,000 nanograms. Standard forensic DNA testing, the kind used for routine CODIS submissions, typically wants at least half a nanogram to a full nanogram of clean, reasonably intact DNA to work reliably. And even that can be a stretch with older evidence. 0.4 nanograms, degraded across nearly 60 years of storage in 2 earlier rounds of destructive testing, was less than what many labs would consider workable at all. This was the last remaining trace of a crime committed 58 years earlier. And if this attempt failed, there was a very real chance nothing would ever be left to try again. Otham's lab succeeded in developing a usable genetic profile from that vanishingly small sample, unique enough to submit into genetic genealogy databases rather than only the standard criminal offender database. This is the part of the story where an ordinary lab process turned into something considerably more dramatic than anyone expected, because the sample still had to physically survive being shipped from New York to Texas. And that is where FBI Special Agent Kenneth Jensen, assisting the Elmira Police Department, found himself in the middle of a genuine race against time that had nothing to do with detective work at all, and everything to do with the weather. It's worth taking a moment to understand just how quickly this entire field has grown, because it's part of why a 62-year-old case like Mary's could suddenly become solvable in the same handful of years that so many other cold cases across the country were also finally breaking open. Forensic genetic genealogy, in its modern investigative form, has only really existed since around 2018, when it was used to identify a serial predator in California, responsible for a string of murders and assaults stretching back to the 1970s, a case that had gone unsolved for over 40 years and was considered by most investigators to be permanently cold. Since then, the same basic method, small departments partnering with specialized labs, uploading profiles into genealogy databases, and building family trees outward from whatever DNA survives, has helped identify both victims and perpetrators in cases going back decades, occasionally even longer than Mary's. A well-known Philadelphia case involving an unidentified young boy found deceased in the 1950s was finally given back his real name using this same approach after sitting unidentified for well over 60 years. Mary's case sits comfortably alongside cases like that one, proof that the length of time a case has been cold is no longer, on its own, a reason to assume it never will be. Jensen understood exactly what was riding on this shipment. The DNA sample was fragile, degraded, and essentially irreplaceable. The product of 58 years of careful preservation and a laboratory process that had only barely managed to extract something usable from it in the first place. He packed it in dry ice inside a cooler and sent it out for overnight delivery to the specialized lab in Texas. And then, almost unbelievably, the shipment ran straight into a historic ice storm that shut down the FedEx hub in Memphis, Tennessee, the largest FedEx hub in the entire world, the central sorting point through which an enormous share of the country's overnight air freight passes every single night. And the exact hub Jensen's package happened to be routed through. The package simply stopped moving. Communication with FedEx during the height of the storm was nearly impossible. Jensen would later describe not even being able to get anyone on the phone at the shipping company, while the clock quietly ran out on a piece of evidence that depended entirely on dry ice that would not last forever. Dry ice sublimates, meaning it evaporates directly from solid to gas over time. And once it's gone, whatever it was keeping cold begins to warm. And whatever DNA is left inside begins to break down further, faster than at any point since 1964. Every hour the shipment sat stranded in a frozen, shut-down distribution hub was an hour closer to that dry ice running out, and with it, the last usable trace of Mary's case. Jensen reached out directly to fellow FBI agents stationed in Memphis, and it turned out the Bureau had an existing liaison relationship with the FedEx hub itself, built for exactly this kind of situation. Evidence shipments that couldn't simply wait out a storm like an ordinary package could. An agent went looking for it inside a shut-down, ice-locked distribution center, serving the entire eastern half of the country's air freight network. A building the size of a small city, full of millions of packages, frozen in place mid-transit. Sergeant Goodwin would later describe it simply as a massive scavenger hunt for one small package somewhere inside one of the largest logistics buildings on the planet, made worse by the knowledge that if this particular piece of evidence didn't survive, there might not be another chance to try. Not with a sample this small to begin with. The agent found it just in time. The dry ice was placed in the Bureau's own freezer to buy additional time while the storm continued. And once it finally passed, the sample completed its journey to the lab in Texas intact. It's a strange thing to realize that after 58 years of patient preservation, 3 rounds of laboratory testing, and a scientific breakthrough that finally made a match possible, the entire case very nearly came down to whether one FBI agent could track down a single cardboard box inside a frozen warehouse before a block of dry ice finished melting. With a usable genetic profile finally in hand, genetic genealogists began the slow work of building outward from Mary's case, one distant relative at a time. This is nothing like the instant database hit people sometimes imagine when they hear the phrase DNA match. It's closer to reverse engineering a family reunion using nothing but fragments of shared ancestry, cross-referencing distant cousins, tracing surnames through public records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and census data, narrowing an enormous branching tree of possible relatives down and down and down again, generation by generation, until eventually one name sat at the center of it in a way none of the others did. The genealogists work in a case like this spend their days doing something that looks, from the outside, almost nothing like detective work at all. It looks like sitting at a computer for weeks, sometimes months, building spreadsheets of names, marriage dates, and hometowns, printing out family trees that stretch across multiple sheets of paper taped together, and slowly crossing out branches that don't fit until only one remains. It's patient, unglamorous work, closer to genealogy hobbyists researching their own ancestry than anything from a television crime drama. And it's exactly that patience that eventually succeeded where 58 years of traditional detective work never could. That name was Alfred Raymond Murray, Jr., a man who had lived his entire life in Elmira, the same small city where Mary disappeared, and who had died there in 2004 of natural causes, entirely unconnected, as far as anyone had ever known, to her case. Murray was born in Elmira in 1931, served in the United States Army, and later worked as a truck driver, raising a wife and 3 children of his own in the same city where Mary Theresa Simpson had grown up and where she died. He had, by all outward appearances, lived an ordinary life in the same small city for over 7 decades. The kind of life where, as Sergeant Maloney put it, you'd expect a name like his to come up eventually if there was anything to find. It never did, not once, across 62 years. Investigators did uncover a documented history of prior offenses involving children that stretched back decades, including an incident when Murray himself was only 17 years old, involving 2 7-year-old sisters. Though, as Sergeant Goodwin would later put it carefully, no single incident on its own proves responsibility for Mary's murder. What it did was line up, uncomfortably and specifically, with both the genetic evidence and the broader pattern investigators were now seeing for the first time in a man who had otherwise moved through his entire adult life without ever drawing the kind of scrutiny that might have connected him to Mary decades earlier. Investigators found no evidence that Murray and Mary had ever known each other. No shared neighborhood, no family connection, no overlapping social circle. Nothing that would explain whether 2 lives intersected on that particular night in March. The most likely explanation investigators arrived at was the coldest kind of coincidence there is, that Mary was simply in the wrong place, walking home on an ordinary night, when an opportunity presented itself to someone capable of taking it. Chief Thorne would later describe it plainly at the press conference, stating that investigators don't believe the 2 of them knew each other at all, and that this was most likely, in her words, a crime of opportunity. Genetic genealogy narrows a family tree down to a strong candidate, but it doesn't, on its own, provide the kind of courtroom-grade confirmation a homicide case needs, especially when the suspect has been dead for nearly 2 decades and can never be tried, questioned, or cross-examined about anything investigators found. To get that level of confirmation, investigators needed a direct DNA sample from Murray himself, which meant obtaining a court order and exhuming his remains from where he'd been buried in Elmira since 2004, undisturbed and, until that point, entirely unsuspected of anything connected to Mary's death by anyone who had ever known him. Exhuming a body for evidence isn't a simple administrative request. It requires presenting a judge with enough investigative basis, in this case, a genetic genealogy profile pointing specifically at one deceased individual, to justify disturbing a grave that had otherwise been left in peace for over 20 years. It involves coordinating with the cemetery, with Murray's surviving family, who by every account had no idea any of this was coming, and with a forensic anthropologist classified to recover a usable sample from remains that had been in the ground for 2 decades. None of that happens quickly, and none of that happens quietly within the department itself, since it requires sign-off from prosecutors who need to be confident the science actually justifies disturbing a dead man's grave before they'll ever ask a judge to approve it. By this stage in the case, Kenneth Jensen, the FBI agent who had once raced an ice storm to save the last of the DNA evidence, had retired from the Bureau and gone to work as a forensic case manager for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. It was Jensen who told Sergeant Goodwin that the organization could help fund and coordinate the next step. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children provided both the funding and the expertise of a forensic anthropologist. And in November of 2025, roughly 3 months before the case would finally be announced closed, Alfred Murray's remains were exhumed for direct DNA comparison against the genetic profile developed from Mary's preserved clothing 61 years earlier. Dozens of officers attended the exhumation, many of them retired, having worked the case at some point across 6 decades without ever getting to see it resolved. There's something worth pausing on in that image alone. Grown men and women, some in their 70s and 80s themselves by then, standing in a cemetery on a November morning, watching a forensic anthropologist carefully do the one thing none of them had been able to do across entire careers, which was finally get close enough to the truth to test it directly. The comparison came back with a probability of less than 1 in 320 billion of the DNA belonging to an unrelated individual, a number so astronomically large it functions in every practical sense as absolute certainty. For comparison, there are only about 8 billion people alive on the planet today. Alfred Raymond Murray Jr., dead for over 20 years, deceased before anyone had connected his name to Mary Theresa Simpson in any way, was confirmed as her killer. Elmira Police Chief Kristen Thorne stood before a room of current and former officers, FBI partners, and Mary's surviving family members at a joint press conference with the Chemung County District Attorney's Office, and announced what 6 decades of officers, most of them long retired and some no longer living, had worked toward without ever knowing if it would happen in their lifetime. She called it a historic day for the department and said that justice had come after almost 62 years. Chief Thorne was careful, even in that moment of resolution, not to overstate what the department could and couldn't say publicly. When asked for further detail about the nature of Murray's prior offenses against children, she declined to elaborate, citing legal protections, a boundary the district attorney's office also maintained throughout the conference. It's a small detail, but a telling one. Even after 62 years, even with the case formally closed, and the man responsible long dead and entirely beyond prosecution, the department still handled the remaining unknowns with the same careful restraint it had presumably always tried to bring to Mary's case. Also present in the room, though not at the podium, was Christina Finelli, a writer who had spent the previous year researching Mary's case for a book titled What Happened to Me? Exploring the Mary Theresa Simpson Cold Case, published only the previous September, months before the case broke open. Finelli said afterward that Murray had never once appeared anywhere in her research, never showed up in any of the old leads, rumors, or family theories she'd spent a year combing through. She admitted she'd expected, if the case were ever solved at all, that it would turn out to be someone connected to Mary's own family. Instead, it was a stranger who'd lived quietly in the same small city the entire time. Retired Sergeant William Maloney, who had joined the force a year after Mary's murder and spent a career walking Elmira streets, said much the same thing in his own words. Across everything he'd seen and everyone he'd met over the decades, Murray's name had simply never come up. Sergeant Goodwin, who had personally shepherded the case through its 2003 and 2014 dead ends and into its eventual resolution, put the entire arc of it simply: the family finally got an answer, and the case was never forgotten. District Attorney Whedon Wetmore added that the wheels of justice move slowly, but that the Elmira Police Department had done a genuinely tremendous job keeping this case alive across 3 different generations of officers who worked it. There's a particular atmosphere to a press conference like this one, different from the kind called to announce an arrest or a trial. There was no defendant to prosecute, no verdict still to come. Nothing left hanging that a courtroom would eventually resolve. What filled that room instead was something closer to a collective exhale. Decades of officers who had each, in their own time, inherited this file and done what they could with it, finally getting to see the last page written. Retired officers stood alongside current ones. Family members who had waited a lifetime sat in the same room as investigators who'd only joined the case in its final years. 6 decades of an institution's patience, all arriving at the same podium on the same February afternoon. Linda Galpin was 78 years old when she finally learned who killed her younger sister. She had spent those 78 years thinking about Mary every single day, carrying a version of her sister frozen at 12 years old, while Linda herself grew up, grew older, and eventually became the kind of person who could stand at a podium and thank an entire police department for never giving up on a promise made to a family 62 years earlier. Her mother, who had been pregnant with Mary's younger sister the spring Mary died, did not live to see this day. Linda said that she wished her mother could have been there to hear it too. Also present at that February press conference were Mary's uncle, Dwayne Bowman, and her cousin, Ronnie Bowman, family members who had grown up in the long shadow of a question that never got answered at family gatherings, birthdays, or holidays for 6 decades. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from not knowing, one that sits differently than grief over a death alone, because it never lets a family fully close a chapter. Every anniversary, every mention of Mary's name at a family dinner carried the same unfinished weight it had the very first year, because nothing had changed, and nothing could change until someone finally had an answer to give them. It's worth being honest about the fact that even now, even with a name, a confirmed match, and a probability so vast it functions as certainty, Mary's case still isn't fully answered. Not in the way we might want a story like this to resolve. Investigators have never determined exactly what happened in the hours between Mary leaving her cousin's house and her body being found 4 days later on Combs Hill Road. They've never established a precise sequence of events, only the beginning and the end of it. Chief Thorne's own account that this was most likely a crime of opportunity between 2 people who had never met is a working theory built on the absence of any connection between them, not a confirmed narrative of the night itself. The department has also chosen not to disclose the specifics of Murray's prior offenses involving children beyond confirming that a documented history exists, citing legal protections that apply even to a man who has been dead for over 20 years. That's a choice worth respecting rather than second-guessing, since the department presumably weighed what serves the public interest against what could cause unnecessary harm to people still living, including Murray's own children, who by every indication had no idea what their father had done, and who are, in their own way, also left carrying the weight of an answer they never asked for. Mary Theresa Simpson's case is now being described by some outlets as one of the oldest homicides ever solved, using forensic genetic genealogy, a technology that didn't exist for the first 58 years this case sat open, and that only became precise enough to work with 0.4 nanograms of degraded evidence in the last few years. Genetic genealogy as an investigative tool has only existed in its modern form since around 2018, when the Golden State Killer case first proved it could work at scale. In the years since, it's helped identify suspects and victims in cases going back decades, sometimes over half a century. Cases that everyone involved had long since assumed would simply never be answered. It's worth sitting with what that actually means for every other case out there, including every unsolved case we've covered on this channel. The farmhouse in Bavaria, the woman in the Norwegian Valley, the man on the Australian beach whose identity took DNA and genetic genealogy to finally confirm, in a case with real parallels to this one. The family in Iowa, the 3 women who vanished from a house in Missouri. All of them predate modern genetic genealogy too. None of them are unsolvable simply because they're old. They're unsolved because, so far, no one has had the right fragment of preserved evidence, the right funding, the right database match, or the right decade of scientific progress to catch up with them. Mary's case is proof that the gap between never and eventually can be 62 years long and still close. If you've made it this far into tonight's video, whether you're still wide awake or drifting somewhere between here and asleep, it's worth sitting for a moment with everyone this case represents, beyond just Mary and her family. Every unsolved case has a version of Linda Galpin somewhere. Someone who was young once and is old now, who has spent a birthday, a holiday, an ordinary Tuesday, thinking about a person who never got to grow up alongside them. Every cold case file sitting in a records room or a department freezer represents a family who is, in their own way, still exactly where the Simpson family was for 61 of Mary's cases, 62 years. Waiting, without knowing whether the answer will ever come, or whether it will come in their lifetime at all. That's where we'll leave it tonight. You've spent this last stretch of time somewhere far from your own bed, and now it's time to come back to it. Back to the quiet of your own room, your own breathing. Slower now than when we started. There's nothing left to solve tonight, just the rain and the low fire, and the dark, patient and warm, ready to carry you the rest of the way. Rest now, comfortable, safe, let go completely. Good night.